little bit more on the default mode network. I just want to emphasize how closely correlated this network is to a variety of psychological, psychiatric disorders. It's actually kind of crazy how closely involved we have found through literature the default mode network to be. And I believe one of the main reasons for this is because the default mode network is so closely related to functions of language, an individualized sense of self, and narrow focused attention. All of these things come together to make us really good at solving problems and finding things through the basis of knowledge, through the sacrifice of missing the whole picture for the details, the trees for the forest. But that also causes us to lose things that are really important in terms of mitigating psychological suffering because we become so adherent to these problem-solving capabilities. It truly is a double-edged sword. We can see from fMRI studies, different types of literatures, imaging data, EEG data, that default mode network activity tends to be through the roof for people who are high in trait neuroticism from the 5-factor model and people who meet criteria for a variety of mental health disorders. An easy example to think about this is generalized anxiety disorder. What is one of the main mechanisms of action at play? It's rumination, right? This inability to control excessive worry or anxiety about things. This is so closely correlated to the default mode network, it's arguably reasonable to say that they're just different descriptions of the same thing. Rumination, the inability to control worry, and activation of these brain functions, it is very, very tightly correlated in both directions, not just for pathology, but also the alleviation of pathology. When we treat anxiety disorders, when we treat rumination, when we treat these underlying problems, we see a decrease in default mode network activity. We also see an increase in other brain network activity that we know are more correlated to the psychology of awakening and freedom from psychological suffering. And I just want to make this clear as well. It's not really that complicated, this freedom from psychological suffering. If we know some of the main roots are language, adherence to an individualized sense of self, more specifically adherence to language and adherence to certain functions of the mind that help us in certain ways but cause problems in other ways. We also know that removing adherence or attachment to these functions helps us to improve psychological functioning as well. This is exactly what we're training when we're talking about salience network, central executive network, and other functions of the brain. More experientially, we find that the functions of the mind related to default mode network activity, that sense of self, language functions, thoughts, emotions, adherence, rumination, negative factors, they actually dissolve after a certain point, which is perhaps the most interesting thing. I remember I was talking to a friend not too long ago, and she is someone who has had a variety of mental health challenges, and she told me that her mind is never, ever quiet. There is always some negative thought going on. There's always some rumination. There's always some what if. There's no peace within her mind. There's always something going on. Whereas someone who has been through more meditative training or has had some success from psychotherapy, they often report to me as patients that they are able to sit in silence. They're able to sit quietly. This mind is not always overly active. The mind is quiet. The mind is still. The mind does what they want it to do. These are all functions of someone who's much more flexible, not only in terms of their psychological functions, but also in terms of how their brain is functionally connected. The salience network, central executive network, default mode network, you can change the interconnected nature of all of these through a variety of different practices, as we have talked about before. Now, it's not a problem to have some mental activity. The problem starts when we become too adherent or can't control these functions of the mind, which does indeed happen as evidenced by everything I've just said and a whole variety of psychological disorders and the many patients that you will see if you are in this line of work. But the default mode network is also great for problem solving, for different functions, for ensuring our survivability. It has a lot of essential characteristics that make us what we are, human. It's just a matter of being able to control things in an effective way. It's just like tuning a violin. If you take the string and you turn that peg a little too much, the string is going to break. You're going to have problems. You need to get a new string, you need to retune it, you need to recalibrate. If that string is too loose, you are also not going to get anything useful out of it. It's just when you have the right amount of tuning, the right amount of functional connectivity, the right amount of mental control, that's when you start to see optimal functioning. Someone who's flexible can use these functions when they need to, and when they don't need to, those functions fall back into their pocket. It's not always active, it's not always taking control of their life. Finding that balance is most important. This is worth emphasizing again because you will see in many different spiritual literatures, they're talking about completely going to the other end of mental training and completely silencing these functions, being that way all the time in all aspects. That is not what I want to teach. I want to teach someone to be balanced, to find ways to live their life and also realize freedom from psychological suffering through understanding the nature of what they are as ultimate reality, and also through understanding that they're also manifesting as this individualized sense of self, or so it feels, right? We don't want to negate things in terms of our individual sense of self as well, because in a sense, that is completely accurate. That is what we are. It's just not the whole picture. And until we see that whole picture, we're going to remain attached to a very small sliver of what is actually going on. Once you realize this, once you understand this, you become more flexible and you see how there are more dimensions to you than you initially thought. Once you have that picture, you understand it fairly well, it will allow you to be free from psychological suffering in the sense that you become more flexible in terms of how you understand things, and you become more flexible in the sense that you are not attached or adherent to things that you know carry no permanent essence of what you are.